I went to visit the U.S. Marines Memorial in Arlington. It's right across from Arlington Cemetery. It was too hot for me to go walking in the cemetery, but I went to visit this statue. It's a famous statue based on the picture of the guys raising the flags on Iwo Jima, raising the flag on Iwo Jima. And it's hard for me to express how important this statue was to me when I was a kid. I had a little model of it on my desk at home. We would visit it whenever we were in Washington. We had cousins in Washington. Whenever we visited them, we would go to the U.S. Marines Memorial and look at the Iwo Jima statue of Marines raising the flag after this terrible island by island fight that they were fighting against the Japanese in World War II. So when I went there, I had this, you know how things from the past will give you these visceral memories. You can almost feel what it was like to be there. And I realized that I felt like my childhood is now from another time, almost another planet. And, you know, it was this sense that I had. I loved this statue because it represented America to me. It represented the fact that America had won World War II and was now fighting the communists in the Cold War, and that we stood for something. We stood for freedom, and it was loving your country was almost required. I mean, the idea that you wouldn't love your country, no matter how liberal you were, no matter whether you were a Democrat or a Republican, everybody knew that had lucked out in being born in this country, and it was a wonderful country. So I was listening to Biden's 4th of July speech, and I'll just play this a little bit of it. It really got to me. It was not an evil anti-American speech. It really wasn't. But this was his idea of what was going to inspire us. This is cut 25.
245 years ago, we declared our independence from a distant king. Today, we are closer than ever to declaring our independence from a deadly virus. That's not to say the battle against COVID-19 is over. We've got a lot more work to do. But just as our declaration in 1776 was a call to action, not a reason for complacency or a claim of victory, it was the call to action. The same is true today. Back then, we had the power of an idea on our side. Today, we have the power of science.
So once we fought an empire for the ideal of liberty, now we've gotten over the flu. Then we had ideas, now we have meds, you know. It wasn't an evil speech. It was just stupid. It has nothing to do with what this day is about. You know, Biden at one point said, you can't define what an American is. I can. Sure I can. I mean, we are defined by our ideas, not by our meds, not by our science, not by getting over the flu. Everybody gets sick. Everybody gets over it. Everybody fights it the same ways. But this was a unique moment, July 4th, and we've kind of lost that sense of our own uniqueness, our own decency, our own goodness. Certainly the left has. I mean, the latest poll shows that 57% of respondents to this poll do not believe that Joe Biden is in charge of the country. And obviously he's not. But the left, who back him, are willing to say much uglier things. And they say them with such offhandedness. NPR has a thing where they read the Declaration of Independence every year, and this year they couldn't do it without a trigger warning. They said, over the past 32 years, Morning Edition has broadcast a reading of the Declaration of Independence by NPR staff as a way of marking Independence Day. But after last summer's protests and our national reckoning on race, the words in the document land differently. You can always hear those weasel words, that passive tense. The words land differently. On whose ears? To whom? It's always this kind of passive thing that's happening. It's just out there in this atmosphere. It's just not a bunch of elites sitting around talking. They go on to say the Declaration famously declares that all men are created equal, even though women, enslaved people, and indigenous Americans were not held as equal at the time. Wow, deep, man. That is really deep. You know, people, we live in time and we create ideas, and then slowly over time we live more and more into the meaning of those ideas so that we are now free to reach back to the people who created the ideas and yell at them and insult them for not having been the people that were created by the ideas they created. Oh, wait, that's not deep. That's incredibly stupid. I mean, they just can't come out and say, this is fabulous. This is a great thing that has happened in the world. You know, not every day. It's not every day that you have to mention our flaws. We all know we have flaws. On July 4th, you know, it's like having somebody's birthday and saying, oh, it's your birthday. You're closer to death, you know. You don't have to say, oh, it's July 4th. We're flawed, but just say, it's great. It's great that this happened. It's a fantastic thing that's happened. Let's try and take care of it as our ancestors did when they died for it. The other thing that really got me was this, at this same, celebration, Vanessa Williams, who was Miss America for about 10 minutes during the Reagan era, and then they found she had done some S&M nude shots, and they kicked her out of being Miss America. But I've always liked her. She's a talented singer. She's a decent actress. She sings what is now called the Black National Anthem.
Lift every voice and sing till earth and heaven ring. Ring with the harmonies of liberty. Let all rejoicing rise high as the listening skies. Let it resound loud as the rolling sea.
So I don't want to make too big a deal out of this, but it's in keeping with what the left is trying to propose. This is a poem, Lift Up Your Voice, is a poem written by a black poet, I don't know, around 1900, I think it was, to celebrate Lincoln's birthday. And it has become called the Black National Anthem because it's very important to the civil rights movement. But do the blacks really want a national anthem? Do they really want Juneteenth to redefine this country as founded on Juneteenth when the slaves were freed, or 1619 when the slaves were sold? Do they really want to be different than the rest of us, that different than the rest of us? Because the whole thing about it is the logic of it doesn't work. They want to be, they are laying claim to having been offended in their American rights that didn't exist before America, that weren't codified like they were in the Declaration and in the Constitution. And so if they want to kneel when the flag is flown, if they want to insult the flag, they're essentially saying, oh, we're not part of this country. We're not part of this country, and we want our rights. You don't have any rights if you're not part of this country. I mean, you have God-given rights, but it's only here that those rights are recognized as God-given, and only here that they're protected. So all I'm saying is that when I stood before the Iwo Jima statue and had that visceral memory of what it was like to be proud of America and a country that was proud of itself, I couldn't help but feel that maybe we were in this period of decline. And the decline of America is something that people have been predicting and talking about, certainly since, the beginning of the country. Really, at the beginning of the country, I think it was Benjamin Franklin who, as they were at the Constitutional Convention, he was looking at George Washington's chair, and on George Washington's chair there was a sun kind of on the horizon. It was just like a half sun. Here's a picture of it if you're watching. It's just a half sun. And Franklin said he wasn't sure whether the sun was setting or rising until actually they did put out the Constitution. And then he said, okay, maybe it's rising. But it's been a concern. The decline of America has been a concern from the very beginning. Barton Swaim, in this Saturday's Wall Street Journal, reviewed a new book called Fears of a Setting Sun by a Syracuse University professor named Dennis Rasmussen, who says that all of the founders, most of the founders, feared that America was going to go in instantaneous decline. Here's Barton Swaim describing that. He says, Washington in his latter years thought parties or factions would tear the country apart. Alexander Hamilton believed characteristically that the federal government, and especially the executive, too anemic to govern so vast a republic. John Adams doubted the people possessed sufficient virtue to make democracy work. Benjamin Rush came to believe the Constitution a hopeless mess and doubted a nation so bewhiskied and bedollared had much hope. John Marshall was sure the nullification crisis of 1832-33 meant the end. Thomas Jefferson agonized that slavery would tear the country apart. Only James Madison thought the country would likely do just fine. And one of the reasons they felt like this, and they were so conscious that the republic was fragile, is because they knew about an idea called anacyclosis. And anacyclosis is an ancient Greek idea, which means the cycle of regimes. And it's in Plato, it's in Aristotle, but the most cogent and cohesive statement of it is in a later but still ancient Greek historian named Polybius. And the way it works is kind of like this. It's a little pat. It doesn't have to work like this, but the way it's explained is that there's chaos, and then finally, to settle the chaos, a man arises and becomes king. And this kingship Polybius says, it's by no means every monarchy which we can call straight off a kingship, but only that monarchy which is voluntarily accepted by the subjects and where they are governed rather by an appeal to their reason than by fear and force. So this monarchy is a good thing, but as the monarchy descends through the family of the first king and it's taken on by people who don't care or who have become corrupted by power, it devolves into a tyranny. So kingship devolves into tyranny. After a while, the powerful people who aren't the tyrant get sick and they overthrow the tyrant and they establish an aristocracy. That's kind of what happened with the Magna Carta, where they said to King John, you've got to give the aristocrats, the noblemen, some rights. And there's a good version of this, the aristocracy. Polybius says, we can't style every oligarchy an aristocracy, but only that where the government is in the hands of a selected body of the justest and wisest men. So you can have a good aristocracy, but again, as these elites become corrupt, as they seek to consolidate their power and keep anybody from getting at their power, even if they're failures, lazy, corrupt, and stupid, finally, then the aristocracy becomes an oligarchy, right? Just a tyrannical rule by a few, and then the people get sick of that, and they have now become cohesive enough to rise up, and they establish a democracy. And here's what Polybius says about a democracy. It is no true democracy in which the whole crowd of citizens is free to do whatever they wish or purpose, but when in a community there is a traditional and customary reverence to the gods, to honor the parents, to respect our elders, and to obey the laws, the will of the greater number prevails. That is what is called a democracy. Ultimately, as we see, freedom, Plato said this, freedom becomes the only value in a democracy, and a democracy descends into mob rule. And then what happens? A strong man has to bring order again, and you go back to a king. And that's the cycle, that's anacyclosis, the cycle of regimes. And it doesn't have to be that pat, but the point is, nothing humans make can last. Everything is flawed, inherently flawed, and those flaws will eventually undermine it. And the founders thought, well, maybe if we mixed up the regimes with some democracy in the House, some aristocracy in the Senate, monarchy in the presidency, maybe we can forestall that decay, but they weren't certain they could. So the question always becomes, in moments like this, when it feels like we're in decay, the question becomes, is it the time? Has the time come when democracy, when the republic will fall and be replaced by a king? Or should we keep fighting? Should we give up? Should we pick the best king? Like those who picked Augustus got a good king in the Roman Republic. As the Roman Republic fell, the people who stood for Augustus actually wound up with a very good king. They were actually freer after the empire came than they were before the republic fell, when the republic had just become a sort of series of civil wars and tyranny. Or should we be like Cicero? My son, Spencer Klavan, no relation, wrote a wonderful piece once in the LA Times talking about Cicero, how he basically could not sign on to an empire, and so he retired, and he wrote about democracy until the regime came and found him and killed him. And that his writing inspired John Adams, right, thousands of years later. And John Adams on July 4th made the speech where to encourage them to declare independence, and they did, because his oratory, in part modeled on Cicero, brought them to their feet. Now, I side with Cicero because I believe that God made us to be free, and I believe that we should fight for freedom always, even as our democracy descends, if our democracy descends. Christianity and its mother religion, Judaism, teaches us in the words of Isaiah, the nations are like a drop in a bucket. They are regarded as dust on the scales. In other words, only God is eternal. The nations come and go. And Jesus said we should render unto Caesar what is Caesar's and unto God what is God's. So we should obey the law until it takes from us the thing that makes us godly men, the truth about who we are. When government forces us to lie, when government forces us to hate our enemies, to hate each other, when government forces us not to be able to worship and live out our relationship to God, that's when we have to stand up against them. And a lot of that's happening right now. You know, the government is demanding that we lie about transgenderism and climate change and race. They're demanding that we hate anyone who disagrees with wokeism. They're telling us that we can't go to church. And the church, like a bunch of weasels, are obeying and shutting down their churches. I don't think we have to stage a revolution, but I think each of us has to be a revolution. Because if you're unafraid to speak the truth, if you're unafraid to love your enemy, if you're unafraid to worship, even when the government tells you that you're not allowed to worship, then you're free. You're a free man. It's like Hemingway said, then they can destroy you, but they can't defeat you. If you can live in the truth, if you can live in love, and if you can live in worship, then the cycle of regimes means nothing to you, because you remain a free man no matter what point that cycle is at, even if it costs you your Twitter page, even if it costs you your job, even if it costs you your life. It is a big thing to ask, but it's the thing that God asks of us, and it's the way we remain free no matter where we are in the cycle of regimes. If you will speak the truth, if you will stand up, if you will worship, then the cycle of regimes cannot touch you.